Thank you, Kale, for your prayer. My intention this morning is to start a conversation, not end it. So in the time that we have left, I promise you I'll ask a lot of questions and hopefully get at you thinking about Jesus. That's my goal. My goal is to get your eyes fixed on Jesus, the author, the perfecter of our faith. It was about year 9. I remember sitting at the train station, and year 9 is probably a rough year for most teenagers. You're kind of in that space between, I'm moving between adult, now I'm back to child. Now I'm back to adult, now I'm back to child. And there's decisions you have to make, there's things that you think about, there's stuff that goes on in your journey in that particular age group that was kind of troubling me. And it used to take me about an hour to get to school, probably a little bit more. And I was just sitting at the train station one day, and a goods train went past. And goods trains keep going. A lot of carriages, and a lot of empty carriages. And I just sat there and I thought, you know what? What if? It's going slow enough. I reckon I can get up to speed and I can just jump on one of those empty carriages and see where it goes. See where I end up. It might take me out of this place. It might take me to a new place. Maybe there's greener pastures somewhere that I can go, that I can chase after. 2 weeks ago, Washington, the Pew Research Center, released these findings. They're fascinating, they're kind of funny. 80% of Americans would, if given even one opportunity, enter a stranger's vehicle for a shot at starting a new life. 80%. Stranger, vehicle. Not surprising? I felt it was a little bit surprising. They say that our research indicated that as long as the driver was headed somewhere else, that was the criteria, somewhere else, anywhere else, more than 3/4 of Americans would get in that person's car without hesitation. Adding, the person who researched it, she adds that neither the make of the vehicle, its intended destination, nor the appearance or temperament of the driver would have any bearing on the decision. 80%. Wow. Provided one thing. Provided that entering the vehicle offered even the remotest possibility of a clean break from the past. 8 out of 10 said they were happy to toss their cell phone and wallet into the ditch and put their destiny in the hands of the very first person who pulled over. The poll found, however, that only 3% of Americans would pick up some weirdo standing on the side of the road with his thumb out. What does that survey tell us? What does that survey say about the culture that we live in? Maybe it's a culture that struggles to understand the narrative that is life right now. Because the reality is we live in narrative, not data. We live in a story, we don't live in facts. We live with relationships, we don't live with an idea. So what would make most people want to change everything at the drop of a hat? Maybe the narrative that you live in is tough. Maybe the narrative that you live in is full of struggles. Maybe the narrative that you live in makes no sense and no one is speaking into that narrative any sense at all. Boston Review interviewed Larissa McFarquhar, a writer for The New Yorker. She has no religious faith. She wasn't raised in a religious family. And the interviewer asked her, your research is on saintly people who make great sacrifices for the good of others. What's the difference between religious and secular people? Her candid response was this: I think that within many religious traditions, there is much more of an acceptance of suffering as a part of life, and not necessarily always a terrible thing, because it can help you become a fuller person. Whereas, at least in my limited experience, secular people hate suffering. They see nothing good in it. They want to eliminate it, and they set themselves up as responsible for doing so. She said that secular people also have no belief in God who will someday put things right. For people of faith, God is in control. God's love will see the world through. Whereas for secular people, it's all up to us. We're alone here. That's why I think, she says, for secular people, there's an additional layer of urgency and despair. Social researchers have looked at how we deal with journey and the suffering that comes with journey and the anxiety and the stress that comes with journeying. And most cultures in the past have commented on it. They have an answer for it. In fact, they would say most religions and philosophers have at their foundation and at their core one question: how do I deal with suffering? How do I work suffering out? And so you have a moralistic approach that has been in some cultures and in some people that, well, it must be because I'm not doing everything right that I'm getting all these things that are wrong. So therefore there's an angry God, and the angry God is waiting for me to do things right, and when I get things right, I'll get it sorted out. Even that view, devoid of a picture of a God of love, still gives people a purpose. At its very core is the idea of karma. The idea that if I do bad, I get bad. But if I do good, I get good. And so life and suffering gives meaning to moving forward and becoming a better person. Other cultures have different perspectives. The transcendental perspective, where this pain and this suffering is not real, it's outside of me. And if I can just get mind over matter, I can put myself to a place that is tranquil. And if I reach that place of tranquility, I've made it. Tragedy happens. School shooting. Something big. It's all over the news. And often there's a comment from someone, a priest, a pastor, a rabbi, on what's happening and what they think is the meaning of all this suffering that's going on. And you only have to read the comments after that is posted to understand that we struggle to understand what is going on. That we struggle to put suffering in its correct place. We struggle to understand. And in our secular modern culture, there's no foundation. We have nothing to hang on. You see, a secular culture says that we make our own destiny. We make our own things that are moral, our own things that are good. And therefore this suffering is just something that is a blip, is annoying, and it's supposed to get rid of. That's why when I walk into Coles, there is aisles and aisles of painkillers. Let's get rid of it. When I go to Africa and I deal with death in Africa, they deal with it in such a different way than we do. They understand the process of life. They understand the narrative. They understand the suffering that comes with it. And in some respect, they try and make sense of it in the big picture. But our Western culture, our secular culture, struggles to find a handle to put on suffering. What is it? If it's all meaningless, and if I just create my own good and my own morality and I chase after that, what do I do with the narrative of suffering? What do I do with that? In my journey, I've tried to understand why so many people resist and reject God. And it seems from the first survey that almost everybody would jump at the chance of something new, some new life. Scripture says, Jesus says, follow me, and I'll give you the abundant life. But the question happens in our culture that doubts in the mind grow from pain in the heart. How could a good God, a just God, a loving God allow, and you can fill in the blank. You all have a narrative to fill in that blank. How could a loving God, a just God, a good God allow such misery, such depravity, such pain, such anguish? And it's crazy as you observe, people who live their whole life without acknowledging God or thought or reference to God, when faced with pain, will ask that question. Their whole life has been nothing to do with God, yet when suffering comes along, what would a good God do like that? Why would he do that? Why would he let that happen? But in my journey, I've also seen the opposite. It's kind of crazy to think how the opposite can happen out of the same situation. C.S. Lewis says suffering plants the flag of truth within the fortress of a rebel soul. Suffering plants the flag of truth within the fortress of a rebel soul. In the midst of pain, people find God. Sometimes trouble awakens a search, a realization of the inadequacy of self-sufficiency. Awakening up to we're not in control and we never were. Adversity can also move people not only to a belief in God, but pull them deeper into the experience of God, into his reality, into his love, into his grace. And I've found in my conversations, in my narrative, the journey of doctrinal truth from the mind to the heart usually only occurs in these times of deep pain. You see, knowing in principle that Jesus is all is one thing. But Jesus all is fully known when all you have is Jesus. So secular culture has no comment on suffering. A while back, a friend posted a painful journey on Facebook. And as he posted that painful experience on Facebook, Christianity commented. Some came from a bad place. Some comments that weren't appropriate. But what I noticed, there was no comment from his secular atheist friends on how to deal with it. So what does Scripture give us? Quick survey of Scripture. Genesis, we know. Evil introduced. Pain introduced. Death introduced. Exodus was a wilderness experience for so many people. The wisdom literature largely dedicated to issues of suffering. And the Psalms. Psalms provide a song and a prayer for every possible situation in life. The psalmist asks the blunt questions of life, the cries of pain. And then there's Jesus, the central figure in Christianity, the man of sorrows. The man of sorrows. You see, if it's a place of tranquility we're supposed to get to, where was Jesus in tranquility in the Garden of Gethsemane? Because Christianity says that pain is real, and that pain happens, and that pain happens to all of us. The psalmist writes this in Psalms 34:18, "The Lord is near. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit." All our misguided attempts to get beyond suffering fall into one of two camps. We either minimize suffering, which harms the sufferer by telling him or her that she needs to get over it or he needs to get over it. Or we attempt to do better in life so that God will stop punishing us. We must remember, however, that the gospel's message is that suffering is real and healing comes through the grace of God. We ask the why questions. Why me? Why now? Why him? Why her? Why this? But I've discovered in my narrative that asking the why assumes that the information and the data I get from the answer has the power to heal. It assumes that. If I just knew why the suffering is happening, we conclude the pain would be easier to endure. My narrative is different, however. Information can't mend my wounded heart. Story of Job. Even if God had told Job why he was suffering, if he'd pulled back the curtain and showed the cosmic battle, Job still would have had to deal with the fact that he lost his health, he lost his wealth, and he lost his family. So through it all, what does it mean for you? What does through it all mean for you? How am I to get through? How do I get through? Through it all describes a journey that needs to be embarked on. Or maybe I'm stuck in a moment and I don't know how to get out of it. Through it describes a tunnel that apparently has a light at the end of it. Through it also means we've made it, we're out on the other side. It conjures up the idea of experience, sleeves rolled up, a battle, a journey, the ups, the downs, the highs, the lows, the all. The all that sometimes we can't even put words around because our hearts ache so much. The pain, the suffering. It's actually the all that makes us all we are. All human beings are driven by this inner compulsion to make sense of their narrative, to make sense of the bigger narrative, to understand the world as a meaningful cosmos. We want to make sense of the through it all. Hence our questions as to the whys and hows of life. One social researcher writes this: as a result, every culture must help its people face issues like pain and suffering, or risk a loss of its credibility. We need a narrative through which we can make sense of our own suffering. Why me? Why now? Why him? Why her? Why this? I've discovered that the why is mostly undiscovered and probably mostly undiscoverable. And I believe that our concern should always be with the who. The one who reveals himself through the suffering, in the suffering, and in us. It's not about getting over suffering, getting out of suffering, or getting better afterwards. Suffering is about God's presence in the midst of our suffering. He will never let you go. He will never let you go. We either medicate, minimalize, or moralize suffering. The how and why questions. Although they're honest questions, we want to know the how and the why. It came out of modernity. It came out of our seeking to dot the I's and cross the T's and to split the atom to its smallest. But the how and why questions can also be a prison. They leave us cold and confused, just as they left Job and his friends cold and confused when they tried to formulate their own answer to the how and why. Not the how, not the why, but the who. Through it all, the who is with you. Through it all, the who hung on the cross for you. Through it all, the who was resurrected and sent his Spirit to live inside each of you. Through it all, the who will make all things new and is currently making all things new in your life. The who is Jesus. The who will get us through it all. In 1871, Horatio Spafford, prosperous lawyer, devout Christian, and his wife Anna were living comfortably with their 4 young daughters in Lakeview, Chicago. In that year, a great fire broke out which devastated the entire city. For the next 2 years, Horatio and Anna devoted their time to welfare work amongst the refugees of the fire. By November 1873, the Spaffords needed some respite. They decided to join friends in Europe, but just before their departure, Horatio was detained on business. Anna, with their 4 daughters, were persuaded to set off without him. But en route, tragedy struck. The steamship they were traveling on, sank after colliding with another ship mid-ocean. Of the hundreds on board, Anna was one of only 27 who were rescued, having been kept afloat by a piece of debris. Her daughters didn't survive, overcome with despair at the loss of her children, Anna felt strongly that she had been saved for a purpose. In Chicago, Horatio received a tragic telegram from his wife. The telegram said, "Saved alone. Saved alone, I don't know what to do. I don't know what my next step will be." He set straight off, Horatio. He wanted to bring Anna home. He crossed the Atlantic and the watery grave of his 4 daughters. As he crossed the ocean, the ship's captain called him up to the bridge and said, "This is where your daughters' lives were lost." Moved by that experience, he went back down to his cabin and wrote these words: "It is well with my soul. When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." Having returned to Chicago, the Spaffords were blessed with more children, a son and a daughter. However, another crushing blow was dealt when their son died of scarlet fever at age 3. The couple's faith remained strong in the face of these difficult times, but Horatio gradually became convinced that the end of days was imminent, and he made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. He wrote a letter to a friend and he said, "Jerusalem is where my Lord lived, suffered and conquered, and I too wish to learn how to live, suffer, and especially to conquer." 6 months after the birth of another daughter, Grace, the Spaffords and new friends set off to Jerusalem. They settled in a house in the old city that is built against the northern medieval city wall. They became known as the American colony. From the beginning, they were generous, sharing what little they had with others, and the American colony quickly became known as a place of hospitality for all. Jews, Christians, and Muslims were all welcome there. When they were joined later by a group of Swedish Christians, they needed larger premises. They moved to another place near the Damascus Gate, where they continued their communal way of life. During World War I, when famine and plague ravaged the city, the American colony operated a soup kitchen for the poor of Jerusalem, and also ran, with permission of the Turkish government, hospitals for the wounded on both sides in the conflict. On Christmas Eve 1925, Horatio and Anna's daughter, Bertha, she was hurrying home to join her husband and her children to go to Bethlehem to sing carols, when she encountered a Bedouin who had traveled 6 hours with his sick wife and their newborn baby on a donkey. They had found the hospital closed to the outpatients because of the Christmas feast. Bertha was greatly moved by their need and later said, "Here before me stood Mary and Joseph and a donkey." It was a new Jesus. She immediately took action. The woman was admitted to the hospital, but by morning she had passed away. The next day her husband came with this baby and begged Bertha to keep the child. He said, "If I take my baby boy to my cave home, he will surely die." And Bertha took the baby, named him Noel, hired a nurse, established them in the house on the wall of the American colony where they had first settled. Within a week, Bertha had been asked to take in 2 more orphan babies. Thus, the Spafford Baby Home was born. Several years later, the baby home developed into a children's hospital with 60 beds and a surgical wing. For many years, it was the only children's hospital in the old city of Jerusalem. And in 1948, it played a role in serving families of all faiths from eastern Jerusalem and its surrounding villages. It's still there today. They offer activities and summer camps, they offer surgery, they offer medical treatment. 30,000 kids. And their mission today is simply to provide a holistic continuum of medical, psychological, social, and cultural services to children and families in need, regardless of race, religion, or cultural background. Making sense of the through it all. I just love that Bertha saw Jesus. I love it that Horatio grabbed hold of the tragedy, lived it, breathed it. It became part of who he was, but it wasn't the end. It wasn't something to just medicate, to push aside, to get rid of. It was something that created a fire in him that still burns today. Because the suffering Jesus on a cross makes sense to our suffering. And all we have to do is keep our eyes on him. Through it all, keep our eyes on Jesus. Through it all, don't deny the pain. Don't deny the suffering. Let's talk about it. Let's deal with it. Let's work through it. But through it all, Jesus is there. And because he won, we win. Because he won, we win. And one day, one glorious day, faith will become sight. We'll be reunited with the ones we've lost. This mishmash of a world that we live in will be no more. The corruptible will be clothed with the incorruptible. And my Jesus will call my name. And he'll call your name. And he'll say, through it all, you kept your eyes on me. Because he won, we win.